Hey guys, I'm here to review You Don't Have to Say You Love Me by Sherman Alexie. So this is a bit of a weird read for me because I never read new releases. But I've been wanting to read more books by Native Americans. I've read one novel by Sherman Alexie, not The True Diary of a Part-Time Indian, but Flight, which I really enjoyed. And I just happened to see this on a list of top 20 nonfiction releases of the summer. So I couldn't help but pick it up. So this is his memoir, but it's written differently than any other memoir I've read so far. Most of memoirs I've read have started in one spot, ended in another spot in a person's life, but this one is this one skips around a lot. It does start. The first chapter is in his childhood, but then the next one skips ahead to his 70s, and the last chapter you could say is sort of the beginning of Sherman Alexie's entire story. And also each chapter I feel like could be read as its own whole. You could read it without having read any of the previous ones or anyone that come afterward. So they're each their own self-sustaining, anecdote. But of course, I recommend you read the book cover to cover because they each have, I think, a lot more impact as a part of that larger story. And throughout the prose chapters are also poems, and I will talk about them at the end. So this I would call, because it's not a narrative per se, it's kind of a portrait of Sherman Alexie and his mother and a little bit of his father and his relationship with both of them and other things, his writing life, his experience with racism, about the Spokane Indians, the tribe he belongs to, and he was raised on the Spokane Indian Reservation. So he covers a lot of ground here, but obviously, as the dust jacket makes clear, the centerpiece of this memoir is his relationship with his mother, and this is one of the most dysfunctional, weird relationships I've seen, and in fiction or memoir, and yeah, so Sherman Alexie's mother, you get the sense, was very kind of cold, not very affectionate. Could be cruel, not abusive though, but cruel, cold, and Sherman Alexie in particular had issues with her because he inherited her propensity to outbursts of rage. So he had problems with her much more than her other children, and but even for a span of 3 years, they don't even talk to each other. So they just have all of these struggles with each other, but ultimately, you do see that his mother, they love each other. And what's interesting about that they've had all these issues with each other but still end up loving is, these dysfunctional relationships I find fascinating, but I find the ones that actually end with the two people involved being on good terms much more interesting than when they leave each other and hate each other and never talk again. I just when two people have had to work so hard to love each other, I think that relationship has a much bigger presence in a person's psyche, and not that I don't think those two people will love each other more than if they had just both, been clear that they loved each other and that they were always there for each other and things like that from the beginning. But they won't take each other's love for granted, I think. I think Sherman Alexie doesn't take his mother's love for granted, like he does for his father. His father, he has a much different relationship with. Sherman shows much more open affection to his father. His father was he says his father never did an unkind thing or said an unkind thing. So they had a much simpler, better relationship. Although at the same time, his father was an alcoholic, was clinically depressed, and would leave for weeks at a time on drinking binges. So you do sort of wonder why Sherman Alexie always loved him more, since he did things like that. But it seems like his father was more emotionally there for him, whereas his mother provided for him materially, but not emotionally. but yeah, I find this relationship fascinating, like I do any other of these weird dysfunctional relationships, and yeah, so that was fascinating. But moving on to other themes, because he does cover a lot more. The Dust Jacket makes it sound like this is basically just about his mother, but it's about a lot more. Um, so he talks about race and racism in his life as a writer, which is really interesting. Um, he talks about two different things in particular, two different phenomena in particular. One is where his white friends will have this idea of Native Americans. No matter how benevolent an idea it is, it's still essentialist and therefore racist. And so what he notices among his white friends is that they will kind of make an exception of him among Native Americans as a whole. They would say things like, "Oh, Sherman, you're different from other Indians. You went to a white school, so you had different experiences from them." Things like that. And the thing is that allows those white people to continue to have their racist beliefs about Indians, but also to be friends with this one Native American that they happen to know. Um, and the other phenomenon is from Native Americans themselves. How it seems often that Sherman Alexie's most passionate critics were actually Native Americans, even though he himself talks about how he's trying to make the struggles of Native Americans more widely known in his fiction and poetry and in this memoir. And what he often hears as a criticism is that he's not Native American enough, and he talks about how that is also essentializing their own race in a way, like that you can measure Native Americanness in some way, and that there is one way to be Native American. And both of these are phenomena that are well documented in the literature of social psychology, in the study of relations between different groups in society. Uh, White people, high status people in general, not just white people, but any high status group, if a person from a high status group, like say a white person, meets a black person or a Native American and becomes good friends, they will just, rather than change their actual stereotypes about that group, they will just make an exception of that person. They'll just say, well, you're different, I know you, they'll come up with excuses for that person or something. And at the same time, minorities will often unknowingly, unconsciously accept stereotypes of their own group that are created by these high status groups for the purpose of oppressing them. So it was interesting to see this man figure those things out. Well, for all I know, I mean, I don't know if Sherman Alexie has read social psychology literature. If he has, kudos to him, because a lot of it is difficult to read. But yeah, it was interesting to see him just figure that out from his own life, from the anecdotes in his own life. And just as someone who studies that. And so that was cool. So another thing I want to talk about is just his discussion of oppression of Native Americans in general. I think in white American schools we learn about Native Americans up to 1890 when the massacre of Wounded Knee happened, and then for all our school courses say Native Americans just kind of fell off the side of the world. But he shows many instances of the oppression of Native Americans in the 20th and 21st century. And not even just like back in the 1930s or something, but like in 2015, when there was a big forest fire on the Spokane Reservation, the U.S. government refused to send help because they just decided that it wasn't a big enough threat, even though there were literally civilians just kind of running over to the forest fire to throw what water they could on the fire or shovel dirt on it. So this continues today. And it's maybe not the most like thorough examination of it, of course, but you don't go to a memoir for that. You go to scholarly work for it. And he also does this interesting social analysis of reservations. And reservations really are kind of the perfect cesspit for rape culture to thrive because of because of the powerlessness that this oppression, this blatant oppression, even today, makes Native Americans feel, and how that's often manifested is in abuse of children and in rape, because rape is ultimately an act of obtaining power more than obtaining sexual gratification, and all of this big broad, these broad things I'm talking about with like the oppression of Native Americans and also racism, is it's always brought back to Sherman's life. It's always relevant to his life. It's never just like, okay, we're pausing from my memoir to talk about Spokane Indians or Native Americans in general. It's always you always see how relevant it is to his life. And Sherman Alexie is an exception among Native Americans because he doesn't live on a reservation. He's obtained socioeconomic success. He went to, and a big part of that is because he left the reservation. He went to a white school. But you get the sense that he could easily have gone the direction of many other Native Americans, and that story is not necessarily special, that his life story and the story of his family isn't really that different from many other families' experiences. So yeah, in that sense, I think this is a good, maybe a decent primer on just the oppression of Native Americans in not modern society. Maybe, it's always more specifically about the Spokane than any others, but still, I think this would be an important book, is an important new release about, just for white Americans to have brought to their attention the fact that, Native Americans are still struggling, that, that they didn't just fall off the side of the earth after 1890. And, but it's also just obviously a fascinating look at this man's relationship with his mother. And so yeah. Now, the poems, I really liked the poems, but I feel like they might not be that interesting outside of the context of this memoir, because they reference a lot of the specific things that happen in the memoir, and yeah, which means that if you were to just read one of them in like a literary journal or in an anthology, you might not really get them or get much out of them. But in the context of the memoir, they really do work. In my mind, they kind of add an exclamation point to whatever anecdote he's just said. They articulate some kind of emotion or thought that he's had in a way that he probably couldn't in prose, maybe. And they comment on what's happened. At one point, there's a chapter called the Greek Chorus. So that gave me the idea that they're sort of the chorus in Greek drama. They comment on Sherman's life and what's happening. So they might not be the most like rigorous, technically the greatest poems, but they do add to the memoir, I think. So yeah. Oh, we have a mad cat. But anyway, I think this is definitely worth a read if you're interested in memoir, if you're interested in the condition of Native Americans today. So yeah, those broad social critiques are maybe not as detailed as a scholarly one, but you don't go to a memoir for a scholarly critique of the socioeconomic condition of Native Americans. You would go to a historian or someone for that. But for a layperson, I think this would be a good primer on that sort of thing. And anyway, I think I'm repeating myself, so I'm just going to end it. But thank you for watching. I really like this book. I do recommend it. So thanks, guys. Bye.